When I was in junior high school, I played in a marching band. Anybody else have that experience? Anybody else here ever played in a marching band? No? No one? You have? All right. There was a basic principle that I learned in marching band. And that is, listen for the beat of the bass drum, right? The bass drum plays throughout the entire march. Even when no other instrument is playing, the bass drum is keeping that beat so that you know how to march, right? Right? You know what I'm talking about, right? The bass drum is critical to a marching band, isn't it? And the bass drum is always playing. So if any of you have ever watched parades where marching bands are marching, you know this, that even when they're not playing a song, you can still hear the beat of the bass drum setting the rhythm for the entire band as they march. So you're familiar with this concept of the drum beat that the bass drum keeps. So we were taught to listen for the drum beat. Listen for that repetitious beat, that rhythm that sets how you walk. The book of Leviticus has a drum beat. There is a repeated refrain that we hear over and over and over again in this book. It is the drum beat of Leviticus. And it is this statement: "Be holy, for I am holy." That statement, or some variation of it, punctuates the book of Leviticus. Let me just give you an idea of how many times it occurs. For example, Leviticus 11, 44 to 45 is the first time we encounter it. It says, "For I am Yahweh your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground." So right in the midst of the purity laws regarding what they can and cannot eat, the rationale for all of this is rooted in this fundamental quality of God, His holiness. But God's holiness is not simply His alone. Because Israel is in relationship with God, because she lives with this God who has taken up residence in her midst, God's holiness transfers to Israel. So Israel now becomes holy merely by virtue of her contact with God, by virtue of living in His midst. We find it again in chapter 19, verse 2. "And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy." And then it proceeds into a number of ethical requirements for relationships, you see. We encounter it again in chapter 20, verse 7. "Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am Yahweh your God." Now you'll notice this one's a little bit different, because this one is phrased as a command to consecrate or to sanctify yourselves. So on the one hand, while it's true that our holiness simply derives from God, we are holy by virtue of being in relationship with Him, there's also a sense in which we have to maintain or practice our holiness. We have to participate in it. We don't simply passively receive holiness from God. We also actively cultivate it. Do you understand? So that's an aspect of it as well, as you can tell from that occurrence. Later in the same chapter, verse 26, you'll see that it occurs again. "You shall be holy to me, for I, Yahweh, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." Now that's an interesting statement added on to it, that holiness has something to do with the fact that Israel is distinct from the nations around her. Israel is distinguishable from her neighbors. There's something different about her. Her neighbors recognizes it, she recognizes it. And it's a difference that Israel maintains. That's a very convicting matter, isn't it? If we are God's holy people, we should be distinguishable from the world around us. People should be able to detect a difference. And that's a powerful thing to keep in mind, isn't it? As we go about our business in the world, that we should always be distinguishable from the rest of the world. 21 verse 8 is our next encounter. It says, you shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, Yahweh, who sanctify you, am holy. Now this is interesting because now we get kind of the other side of what we saw a couple of verses ago. We sanctify ourselves according to the passage that we read, what was it, in 20 verse 7? But in 21:8, God makes it clear that he is the one who sanctifies us, right? So there's an interesting tension here, an interesting correspondence between the fact that God sanctifies us, that holiness can only come from him. It's a gift that he imparts to us. But it's one of those gifts. Have you ever got one of those gifts at Christmas where you open it and the box says, some assembly required? Right? I hate those. I'm no good at assembly, and of course it probably has something to do with the fact that I haven't the patience to read the instructions, and I think I can figure it out myself and always make a mess of it. But if you understand that concept of receiving a gift, it's truly a gift, but there's some assembly required. So holiness is conferred to us by God, but it's something we have to live within. It's something we have to practice, isn't it? A couple of years ago, a friend of mine gave my son a bike. He was 3 at the time, and maybe a little young to be getting a bike. But he's going to have to learn to ride that bike, isn't he? Right? Merely receiving the bike doesn't result in the enjoyment of it. There's going to have to be some training involved, right? There's going to have to be some practice involved for him to learn how to balance on the 2 wheels and how to pedal and how to reverse the pedals to brake and so forth, right? Do you understand? So you understand how a gift can have 2 sides in that regard. It comes from God, and yet it's something that we have to practice. So holiness is a gift God gives us by virtue of our relationship with him, but then it is a quality we have to cultivate as well. It's something we have to practice. So both sides of that we'll have to keep in mind, and Leviticus does a good job of keeping both before us. 22 verses 31 to 33. So you shall keep my commandments and do them. I am Yahweh. And you shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am Yahweh who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh. Now in this particular instance of the drumbeat, we have this interesting connection between Israel's holiness and Israel's salvation. Did you notice that? God talks about, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. So God's deliverance of Israel wasn't merely so that they could be free, it was so that they could be holy. God's salvation has a goal in mind. God's salvation is not really an end in of itself, but he sets us free, he liberates us from sin, he calls us to himself out of the bondage that we were under with another master, in order that we might share in his holiness. Do you understand? So salvation has that goal in mind, and the connection is made there in that passage. And then, of course, outside of the book of Leviticus, this very same phrase occurs in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, where Peter reminds us that this is not simply a requirement for Israel. This is a requirement for anyone who would follow Christ, anyone who would own his name, anyone who would be united with him by faith is responsible for embracing God's holiness and reflecting it in our own lives, as Jesus himself did. He was the very embodiment of holiness, wasn't he? Holiness incarnate among us. And if we're going to be followers of him, identified with him, then we, like him, are going to have to reflect the holiness of the God that we have submitted ourselves to by virtue of salvation. So you can see then, can't you, that it's a drumbeat of the book of Leviticus. But then we hear the beat again in the New Testament, don't we, to remind us that this continues to be a fundamental principle for the people of God. And to understand it is critical to our identity and to our enjoyment of our relationship with God. And so it's really interesting to me how that 1 Peter seems to point us back to Leviticus to say, read that book and understand this quality of God that he has communicated to you and that he wants you to enjoy, because he knows that true fulfillment in life, that true joy only comes through this experience of participating in his holiness. Now that's a tough sell. Most people are not going to believe that holiness has anything to do with joy or celebration or liberation. But the book of Leviticus really shatters that stereotype that holiness is about depriving yourself and restricting yourself and having a solemn face all the time. Is it fair to say that that's kind of the stereotype that seems to accompany most people's idea of holiness? It means that it means like you look like you were weaned on a sour pickle. Just, I'm holy. I'm holy. Don't talk to me, I'm holy. Right? I'm just that you exude an attitude that says stay away. That's not what holiness is. Holiness, in fact, actually attracts people. Holiness has a magnetism about it that makes people want to get close, you see. And this is why God had to warn Israel to be careful about how she approached, because holiness draws us. We actually admire and love the beauty of holiness, and we're drawn to it, but we have to realize that in our sin, to come into contact with holiness is actually dangerous, even deadly. And the book of Leviticus will teach us about that as well. All right, so all that to simply say, this refrain is the drumbeat of Leviticus. And so that's where we want to start in order to get the big picture of this book. Because, the book of Leviticus is one of those books where it's sometimes hard to see the forest for the trees, right? There are so many details. There are so many little laws, little nitpicky things. And we get so curious about them and so bogged down in them that it's so easy to lose sight of what the book as a whole is trying to communicate. So what I want to do this morning is back up and look at the whole thing and say, what is this book really about? And then we can talk about how all those details fit into that bigger picture. But to start off with, I think we need that framework. And that's what we're going to work on building this morning. Now, here are some of the things that we learn from this drumbeat of Leviticus. The first thing that we learn is that Yahweh is holy. In fact, he is inherently holy. Yahweh alone has what we will call inherent holiness. Yahweh doesn't derive his holiness from anyone or anything else. Now, when I say Yahweh, you know that I'm referring here to the personal name of God. I don't know if you are in the habit of using this name. Our English translations typically render this Lord with all caps. Are you all familiar with this? If you will allow it, though, I'm going to use the personal name because I think holiness is about relationship. And in order to communicate that, to keep that in mind, I will use the personal name of God, which we believe was probably pronounced Yahweh. Is that okay? Are you all familiar with that? So you're good. Okay. Yahweh alone is inherently holy. He generates holiness out of his being. It doesn't come from anywhere else. All right? Do you understand? So that's a central assertion to this drumbeat that we've heard is, I am holy, therefore you be holy. Or sometimes the other way around, be holy because I am holy. So our holiness is predicated upon Yahweh's holiness. Right? So if that's the case, then this other would also be true. Yahweh's holiness infects his people with holiness. If we are going to live in relationship with Yahweh, if Yahweh is going to take up residence right here with human beings, which we know he has, he did in Israel, and he did among us in Jesus Christ, and he continues to do so through the Spirit that he poured out in Pentecost, right? He lives within us. His Spirit indwells us. God is living inside of you right now in the person of his Holy Spirit, right? That's a remarkable fact. We are housing the holiness of God within our bodies. So we've been infected with God's holiness. That's His gift to us. So what that means is that whereas Yahweh is inherently holy, we as His people are derivatively holy. We are holy by virtue of our relationship with God. We don't generate holiness within ourselves. We're not capable of it. It's not an inherent quality, but one that we derive from being in close proximity with God. Now, one of the implications of this that I think is important to note at this point is, if you want to be holy, then you need to be close to God. Because that's how holiness comes. If you want to be holy, you have to cultivate that relationship, and you have to cultivate intimacy with God. Because it's only in proximity to Him that we become holy, that we begin to resemble Him. It's rather like a marriage, isn't it? My wife and I just celebrated our 21st anniversary. So we've been married for 21 years. And the longer we're married, the more like each other we become, just by virtue of living together, right? She has domesticated me considerably. A lot of my old bachelor habits, they're gone. They're out there. Some of them took a while. 15 years. It took something to be. She's still working on a few, I must say. But you know how it is when you love someone and you have committed to live your life with that person. It's inevitable that you begin to influence each other and you begin to affect the way each other thinks, and you begin to resemble each other, maybe even to a certain extent physically. That can seem to happen. Do you understand? I'm sure there's a few of you in here that have been married a lot longer than I have even, and you can speak to this, I'm sure, very profoundly. The longer you're married, the more like each other you become. Oh, I'm getting some giggles now. I'm getting curious. Are these giggles of agreement?
I thought.
All right. I'm just gonna leave that alone. I'm just gonna leave that alone. Y'all work that out. I hope I didn't start anything here. Maybe I should just withdraw the statement about physical resemblance. Is that better? All right. So we are derivatively holy. Now, as you can already tell, as I've already indicated, Yahweh sanctifies us by living in our midst. I want you to know this about God. He wants to be close to you. He wants to come and live in our very midst. He wants to live in the midst of the church. He wants to be the center of the life of the church. But He recognizes that He has to be careful about how He enters our midst. God cannot help but be holy. And holiness cannot help but be lethal to sinners. And if you wonder why God took so long, or why God implemented so many rules and rituals in order to live in Israel's midst, if you understand the concept of holiness, I think you'll begin to understand why. It is not a simple matter for a holy God to live in the midst of a sinful people without destroying them. Do you understand? For that to happen, there's a lot of things God has to teach us. And of course, we're talking about an infinite mind trying to communicate with finite minds. And so the best way for Him to communicate is through symbol and ritual and things that may, on the face of them, seem very odd to us because our culture is so different from ancient Israel's. But God was speaking to ancient Israel, right, in the book of Leviticus. And so He clearly adopted their intellectual categories. He adopted their cultural framework, which is why so many of the rules in the book of Leviticus will strike us as odd, even bizarre. So we're going to have to travel back a little bit, and we may experience a little bit of culture shock, right? I'm just like I am now, a little bit. In order to learn how to think like an ancient Israelite and how to enter their symbolic world, if we're going to understand Leviticus and see the powerful truth that it has to communicate to the church today, all right? Now, we must cooperate with this process of sanctification, or we run the risk of losing Yahweh's presence. So, again, this demonstrates that there are two sides of this business of being sanctified, of being made holy. On the one hand, Yahweh confers it by being among us. On the other hand, we have to practice it. We have to cooperate with it. If we don't, we run the risk of forfeiting God's presence, because God will have to withdraw from a people that refuse to conform to his holiness. He will have to withdraw from a people who refuse to abandon their sin. He will not make peace with that, you understand. So if we want God's presence in our midst, if we want that continual contact with him, then other things are going to have to go. Other commitments are going to have to dissolve. Other loves are going to have to go away. And so it all comes down to this remarkable final goal, or the end game, that I think God has in mind with regard to all of this. If we cherish Yahweh's presence, his holiness will sanctify the whole world through our conformity to his holiness. This is the really exciting thing about the holiness of God. What God is seeking to do, he's seeking to reclaim his whole creation from the curse of the fall. Do you remember what happened in Genesis 3? The sin of Adam and Eve wasn't confined merely to them, was it? It had a real impact on the physical world. And for this reason, we read about the fact that thorns and thistles begin to grow in the ground. For what reason? Because Adam sinned, right? And pain enters our experience because of sin and the fall. And so the very makeup of the world is altered or affected in some way by what happened there. But God is not content to leave that as it is. He wants to reclaim the entire creation to himself and make all creation once again serve his purposes without defect or flaw. So he wants to sanctify the whole world. He actually is seeking to do that through you and through me. All other people, he wants to sanctify through our influence, through the way he operates in and through us, and eventually the entire cosmos. And just one passage that I think gives us a good sense of this is Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 22 to 32. Ezekiel was a priest as well as a prophet, and as a result, you can imagine that he would have been quite familiar with the concepts of Leviticus. And evidence of that can be found in this beautiful passage where God through the prophet says, "Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord Yahweh, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came." Now, do you hear that? Israel's failure to cooperate with God's sanctification, with God's attempt to make them holy, resulted in what? The profaning of his name among the nations where they lived. And then he goes on to say, "And I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, and which you have profaned among them. And the nations will know that I am Yahweh, declares the Lord Yahweh, when through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes." So by what means is God going to vindicate his holiness in the eyes of the nations, so that all nations might know who he is and what his character is, that all nations might be attracted to his holiness? How is he going to do it? Notice those words, through you. Through you, and through you, and through you, and through you. It's my opinion. Well, I probably shouldn't say that. It's actually not my opinion. I think it's a biblical fact, a biblical truth, that wherever the church may be in the world, it will be revived when it begins to take holiness seriously again. Wherever the church is dying, wherever the church is languishing, wherever the church has apparently lost its influence, no longer seems to be attracting the world's attention, that will be reversed when the church once again understands and embraces the holiness of God and expresses that holiness through her own life. You see? So I know that in America there's a palpable sense that the church has lost her influence in culture. And there may be many reasons for that, but I think at the root it is the fact that we seldom talk about holiness. And we have forgotten how to practice it. And we've got to understand that what attracts the world to us is nothing about us. It's about the God who dwells in our midst, right? And Jesus himself, I think, indicated this in John 12 when he said, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will do what? Will draw all people to myself." You see, the magnetism of the church is not her programs. It's not her arguments. It's not even her doctrine. The magnetism of the church is the Christ she has been called to exalt and to lift up in the world. Do you understand? Because he is the embodiment of the holiness of God, and that holiness will draw people in. And that's when they will become curious about our doctrine. That's when they'll become interested in our programs. Do you understand? But it all has to start, you see, with this basic fundamental concept. Okay, but we have to, of course, start by asking this crucial question. Because if we're going to understand Leviticus at all, we're obviously going to have to understand holiness, because that's the drum beat, right? That's that bass drum beat that makes the whole book march. So I want to offer you a definition of holiness that I've put together from various texts that I've read in Scripture, that is an attempt to kind of boil it down to its main constituents. So the working definition of holiness that I'll be using throughout this week is the one you see on the screen in front of you. Holiness is radical separation from sin and its effects that restores our singularity of heart, purity of motive, simplicity of action, and positive influence in the world as defined and demonstrated by God. I'm sure you're wondering, could he possibly have come up with a longer, more wordy definition? And I apologize for that, but when you're dealing with a concept like holiness, that's about as succinct as you can really make it, because there's a lot to it. But let me break it down now and talk about each part of that definition so you can understand why I believe each part is as crucial as it is. So from that definition, you probably see that there are 6 vital aspects to holiness that I tried to include. The first thing is, yes, holiness does involve radical separation from sin and its effects. The first step in holiness is for us to remove ourselves from the sins that once enslaved us, because those are defiling and those threaten relationship with God. And as long as we are in any way involved in those things, we are not going to know God intimately, and we're not going to really grow in holiness. So that radical separation has to occur, but that's only the beginning, because there's much more to it than that. When we finally do separate ourselves from sin and its effects, a remarkable thing happens to us. We gain a focus and a clarity that we haven't had for a very long time. I don't know if you've noticed this about sin. As I like to say it, to put it bluntly, sin makes us stupid. Sin has a dramatic impact on our minds. But one of the most destructive things that sin does to our thinking is that it just blows all focus away. It distracts us in 100 different directions. And we find ourselves paralyzed by competing interests. You understand? Sin creates that kind of warfare in the heart, such that the instinct that we have to do good always seems to be sideswiped by our desires to do evil. You understand? And so one of the first things that we lose when we succumb to sin is we lose this singularity of heart, this ability to focus and understand what our lives are really about. And that just brings all kinds of confusion. So we need our hearts to be healed and to be made whole again. This tug of war within the heart, this struggle over who's going to call the shots in my life, who is going to determine what's ultimate, what's supreme, that has to be settled, right? And when God first comes to me in Jesus Christ, he finds me in a condition in which there is a war being waged within my heart. He is the rightful Lord of my life. But I have sold myself to other masters. And they're pulling me this way, and he's pulling me this way. They're telling me to do this, and he's telling me to do that. And I'm like, stuck, paralyzed, and incapable of acting decisively for God. Do you understand? We're going to talk more about that in a moment. The third aspect is purity of motive. Holiness, once it restores our focus and our singularity of heart, the next thing that it does is it purges our heart of all ulterior motives. If we're going to be holy, everything that we do is going to have to be free of selfish motives. Right? Any self-centered motive that we may have, that needs to be purged from our hearts, so that the good that we do for no other reason than to glorify God and to ensure that his name is made great in the earth. To become radically other-centered and to be more concerned about the well-being of others than whatever credit we might receive. Right? So holiness brings a purity of motive that drives out all these ulterior motives. Then a fourth aspect of holiness that follows quite naturally from the previous two is that once we have singularity of heart, once God has full control of our heart again because we've surrendered to him, and once all these ulterior motives have been purged, guess what we're able to do? We are able to act quickly and decisively for God's glory. You see, again, what sin does, sin creates a conflict within me that makes it nearly impossible for me to act decisively and immediately for the good of others. Because I'm always calculating and saying, what's the cost to me and what's the risk? Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, I'm going to illustrate this for you. And to illustrate this, I could really use the help of two volunteers. Now, I'll tell you up front what you're going to do, because it's not fair to ask for volunteers. You get up here and then you find out, oh, great. Now, what he's asking me to do, I have no interest whatsoever in doing. So I'm going to tell you up front. I need a shoulder angel, and I need a shoulder demon, a shoulder devil. Y'all know what I'm talking about? When you have a moral decision to make, and what pops up over here, right? A shoulder devil giving you bad advice, right? And then what pops up over here? Shoulder angel, right? And these two are debating, and you're thinking, going, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Right? And they're saying, look. So who's willing to be my shoulder angel? All right, come on up here. I've got a shoulder angel now, and I need. Okay, who's feeling naughty this morning? Oh, you want to be? Oh, he wants to be the devil. All right. So we need a shoulder. All right, here we go. All right. So we have shoulder angel right here. We have shoulder devil right here. Now this is the scenario. I'm driving down the road. You see, I'm driving on the left side of the road. I'm on the right side of my car, driving on the left side of the road. All right, so I'm driving along, and up ahead on the left, on the curb, on the shoulder of the road, I see a car broken down with flashers. The hood is up, and some poor soul is bent over, right? Screaming kids in the back, whatever, So I'm driving along, and immediately what happens is you think to yourself, your shoulder angel says, what should I do, shoulder angel?
Come over and help the poor guy.
All right. So, yeah, that's what I should do. Yeah. But no sooner does that instinct come up than my shoulder devil says,
I could get struck by an oncoming vehicle.
Good point. To which my shoulder angel then says,
You should do it anyway.
right? What's life, right? Right?
In Darwin, it's hot and it's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to cost me time and I'm tired.
Yeah, I've got to be somewhere. Right, okay. And shoulder angel.
It might be your cousin, your relative, who said. But it probably isn't.
In fact, this could be, who could this be? This could be, yeah, right?
I work at the courts.
Right, but it could, right? I mean, what I'm thinking is this may be a trap, this may be, who knows, he may club me and throw me in the back of his car and take off, right? All right. So do you see it? Yeah, go ahead.
He might have had a heart attack and he's trying to get attention.
That's true too. All right, thank you very much. You guys do you see this conflict, right? That's what I mean when I say that I didn't have a singular heart, did I? Self-interest was competing with helping others, and by the time that debate is settled, I'm too far down the road to stop and help. You see what happened? I missed that opportunity because of a lack of holiness. You see how that works? How many good deeds have we lost the opportunity to do because of this division of heart and this impurity of motive that paralyzed us and made us incapable of acting decisively and quickly for the good of others and for the glory of God? There's probably not a book big enough to hold all the regrets, are there? All the missed opportunities because of this gridlock that seizes us because we don't wholly belong to God. And because His Word doesn't make the decisive decision in a moment like that. Because self-interest is still there, saying, you have somewhere to be. This person could do you harm. This could take more time and money than what you really have to give. Whew. And you drive on by, and the person is left. Jesus told a story very much like that, didn't he? In the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 10, I believe it was, right? And who were the two people who passed by on the other side? A Levite and a priest. Two people who, theoretically, were very familiar with the book of Leviticus. And the one person who was capable of stopping and acting was, of all people, whom? The Samaritan, right? Interesting. Holiness is found in the strangest places sometimes, isn't it? All right, so if you understand that scenario, then I think you understand the issue that arises here for our simplicity and immediacy of action. That's what I mean by that. When you're holy and when your heart wholly belongs to God, there is no question, there is no dispute, there is no warfare in the heart. When the opportunity arises, you act decisively and you do it. And then, of course, if we live that way, can you imagine the positive influence that we will regain in the world? If we were to really live this way, if we were really to have hearts that are wholly surrendered to God, and we're capable of acting decisively for the good of others and His glory, can you imagine how the world would all of a sudden begin noticing what the church is doing and become interested in a fresh way in what the church has to say? Why are you doing this? Why are you sacrificing for others in this manner? You're making such a positive difference in the world. How are you able to do that, right? And I think all kinds of doors would open up. And then, of course, all of this is defined and demonstrated by God. This is simply the character of God, isn't it? Being worked out in the lives of those who love Him and who want more than anything to be like Him, to share in His holiness. All right, so that took a while to explain, to unpack that definition, but I feel like it was so important because without this, I'm afraid we all might be thinking of something different whenever I use the word holiness. But I think maybe now we're a little bit more on the same page. Is that fair to say? Does that give you some clarity with regard to what I'm thinking of when I think about this term, what I really think Leviticus is talking about. It's talking about this. It's talking about this. All right. So that's kind of our orientation to holiness. What I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about the book of Leviticus as a whole. How is it structured? How does the book kind of move? And the first thing you really need to know about the book of Leviticus is that the entire book of Leviticus assumes that Mount Sinai is its setting. This is where we are. This is the backdrop to everything that is being discussed in the book of Leviticus. So this triangle will represent Sinai. This dominates, really, more than just the book of Leviticus. It dominates a lot of the Pentateuch. And I just want to show you, if you were to look at all of the books of the Pentateuch, if you were to place them on a spectrum, and you were to represent how much of the Pentateuch is dominated by the background of Sinai, you would come up with something like this. Of course, the book of Genesis has nothing to do with Sinai, right? It all occurs prior to Israel's deliverance from Egypt and their trip to that mountain. So Genesis lies entirely outside of the environs of Sinai, as indicated by the chart. And it's really about midway through Exodus, about Exodus chapter 19 is when we first arrive at Sinai. Okay? But from that point, we are at Sinai from Exodus chapter 19 all the way through to about Numbers chapter 10. Now that's a huge chunk of the Pentateuch, isn't it? And then, of course, the book of Deuteronomy, like Genesis, occurs somewhere else. It occurs in the plains of Moab. So we're well beyond Sinai at that point, and we've moved on to the very border of the Promised Land. But I wanted to give you this visual representation just to show you how important Sinai is as a setting, as a background for all of this. And what's really remarkable about this is when you look at the actual amount of time that Israel spent at Sinai, it's about a year. This is about 1 year. 1 year from here to here. Now, how many years are covered from creation to this point? Well, millennia, right? Those millennia are not given anywhere near the narrative space that 1 year is given at Sinai. And then when you think about the time that passes from the middle of Numbers to Deuteronomy, you're talking 40 years, right? About 40 years, maybe a little more than that. But that 40 years isn't given near the narrative space that 1 year is given when Israel is at Sinai. Now, what does that tell you about that 1 year? That was an important year. That year receives more narrative space. That year receives more attention in the Pentateuch than the millennia before it that are rather briefly described in Genesis in the first part of Exodus. And it receives a lot more attention than the 40 years after, from there to the land of promise. So whatever it is that God is doing at Sinai, whatever is taking place there, the Pentateuch finds it extremely interesting, and it finds it necessary to cover it in great detail. Great detail. Now let's talk about some of the reasons why Sinai dominates the Pentateuch in the way that it does, and in particular how that Leviticus is the one book that is entirely consumed by Sinai, right? That is entirely contained in this setting, with this backdrop. And it has to do with the fact that God intended for Sinai to serve as kind of a model, a prototype of sacred space. And let me explain what I mean by this. We're going to let the triangle again represent Mount Sinai. And as you read the way events transpire at Sinai from Exodus 19 on, it's very clear that Sinai is divided into 3 zones. Yahweh is at the top of Sinai, right? This is where he appears in fire and smoke and storm and thunder and lightning, right? In a great display of majesty and power that intimidates Israel. So Yahweh appears at the very top of this mountain, and so he kind of settles and enthrones himself there, and this becomes the holiest point on the mountain, because Yahweh has sanctified the mountain by touching down there to meet with Israel. Now, the only person who is allowed to join Yahweh at the top of the mountain is who? Moses. No one else can go to the very top and commune with God intimately the way he can. He actually sees God face to face, right? As Deuteronomy 34 reminds us, there is a special intimacy between Moses and Yahweh that no one else in Israel seems to have enjoyed. So Moses alone is permitted to go to the top of the mountain and to meet and commune with Yahweh there. Now, the elders and the priests, however, are permitted in Exodus chapter 24 to go midway up the mountain and to share a feast with Yahweh. Yahweh remains at the top, and Moses continues to have access to the top. But the elders and priests are allowed only to go midway up, and there they are able to enjoy a meal and celebrate the covenant that Yahweh has just initiated with Israel. All right? The rest of the people, they have to stay where? At the foot of the mountain. In fact, there's a boundary that prevents them from touching the mountain. And back in Exodus 19, and if you heard the sermon Sunday morning, you'll remember this only too well, right? Don't touch my mountain. Anyone who touches my mountain must be stoned. Because what it does is it jeopardizes the whole community, and it potentially destroys the whole community by coming into contact with God's holiness before they're ready for that, you see? And so that has to be taken care of decisively before it breaks out and becomes a detriment to the entire community. But when you look at this, there are very clearly three zones, aren't there, to Sinai? There are three positions, three places. Moses can be at the top. The elders and the priests can go midway up. The people must stay. What does that remind you of? These three zones. What does this anticipate, do you think? The what? The temple, or before that, the tabernacle, right, which had the same layout. There was the outer court, where any Jewish male was welcome to enter and offer his sacrifices on the altar, which was there. There was also a bronze laver there where the priest would bathe before going into the next section behind the veil, which was the holy place, and only priests could go there, right? Right? And then there was another veil behind which stood the Holy of Holies. And there was only one person who could enter there, and that would be the high priest. And even he was restricted to entering that place, how often? Once a year. And on what occasion was he allowed to enter? The Day of Atonement, which we'll get to talk about later this week when we get to Leviticus 16. You see how this works? So Sinai is already training Israel to think in terms of three zones. There are three levels of sacred space. There's an outer court. There's a holy place where those sanctified as priests are enabled to go. And then there's that innermost court, that Holy of Holies, where only the one person who has been designated is allowed to go to intercede between God and Israel. So Sinai is presenting this basic floor plan that will determine the structure of the tabernacle, which is built at this location, right? Much of the book of Exodus is taken up with the instructions for building the tabernacle and the description of how those instructions were carried out. And it will look precisely like this. So the reason why Sinai plays such a dominant role in the Pentateuch and why the book of Leviticus in particular occurs entirely in the shadow of this mountain is precisely because this mountain communicates God's holiness and the way of approach that will define how he is eventually going to make his way down the mountain and into the tabernacle and live in Israel's midst. You see. God's not going to stay on the top of this mountain. This distance is necessary for now until he gives the law and until he domesticates Israel, until he teaches her how to be the kind of people among whom he can live. Once he's done that, guess what he's going to do? He's going to descend the mountain, and he's going to enter the tabernacle that they have built for him. And that is in fact what happens at the very end of the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 40, this glory cloud descends and fills that tabernacle with God's glory. And God takes up his residence with Israel at that point. And from that point on, Israel has to be much more careful how she lives because of the one who lives in her midst. It is a great gift and a great blessing to have God in our midst, but it requires us to alter our lives in radical ways, doesn't it? To live in communion with him. So we'll do one more slide and we'll take our break, because I don't know about you, but I'm ready for morning tea. Sound good? I've hit you with a lot of stuff, haven't I? Yeah. I hope that you brought your bucket empty. There's lots to talk about here. But let's just conclude with this slide where we talk about how that all of this plays out together. I want you to see a very critical connection between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus, because not many people see this connection. Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 through 35 concludes with these words. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. That's what I was just talking about. But once the tabernacle is completed in the book of Exodus, Yahweh then descends Mount Sinai and lives in a tent, just like his people are living in a tent. He takes up residence with them in the very midst of the camp. So now Yahweh is located in this tent of meeting. The next thing we read in Leviticus 1:1 is Yahweh called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. This is the first time that Yahweh has actually spoken to Moses from this new location, from his new residence in Israel's midst. Now, the key here is to recognize this connection. There is continuity here from Exodus to Leviticus. It's almost as if they're one book. There really isn't a boundary between Exodus and Leviticus, just the one that tradition has created by calling the one book Exodus and concluding it where it does, and calling the next one Leviticus. But in fact, the story is continuous, and there's hardly a break at all. There are a few verses after Exodus 40:36 that actually anticipate the book of Numbers that serves as kind of a break. But once we get to Leviticus 1, we're clearly assuming what we've just read in Exodus 40:34 through 35, and God begins to direct Israel from within the camp instead of from on top of Sinai. He has just radically increased the intimacy between himself and his people. And now in this new intimate relation, he begins to instruct them and direct them from within rather than from without. Perhaps it's something rather like what the Spirit does for us, right? The law attempted to instruct us from outside, but the Spirit instructs us and directs us from inside. And doesn't that make all the difference? And just to kind of highlight the continuity, you can see that in yellow I have highlighted the word tent of meeting, and in red the term tabernacle, and you see that these are the terms that make the connection. The tent of meeting in Exodus 40:34 to 35, and then of course the tent of meeting in Leviticus 1 verse 1. Okay, we'll talk more about the significance of that in our second session. But would you bow for me for a word of prayer? We'll conclude with that and have our tea, and then we'll come back for our second session. Father in heaven, we're so grateful to be called to be your people, so grateful that you have chosen to make your dwelling in our midst. Give us a greater understanding and appreciation for what that means and why that's important. And help us to make the changes in our lives that are necessary to welcome your presence and to maintain this relationship with you that makes us effective for your service in the world. It's in Christ's name that we pray, and amen.